Hello. I've just traveled across Canada on one of our transcontinental trains. Not as fast as a jet, but one gets to see more of the countryside that way. While the train was stopped in a northern town on a Sunday noon, I strolled along the main street to stretch my legs. As I came to a movie theater, suddenly the doors opened and a large crowd emerged. Do they have Sunday movies in this town, I wondered? I stepped back to look at the marquee, but nothing was listed. I tried to overhear some comment about the feature. But then I saw something that made me know that these people had not been to a movie. What was it? They were holding books. Prayer books. Why did they carry a book? Well, I can't assume that you are interested in this. I don't know much about you who are watching. You may be churchgoers. You may not. You may be Baptists, Presbyterians, Lutherans, Roman Catholic, United Church, Orthodox, or like me, an Anglican. But whatever you are, I'm sure of one thing. At some time or other, most of you have said a prayer. And when you did, you probably felt that that prayer must come from your soul, from the deepest part of you. It must be real. If it was going to be a prayer, your lips may have moved, your voice may have spoken the prayer, but that wasn't the important thing. What really mattered was that your spirit, the inward you, should be praying. Human beings live in two worlds at once. First, there's the world around us, the world we can see and hear and taste and smell, the physical world. But there's another world, you know, an invisible world. It's the world of the mind and the soul and the spirit. I could ask the cameraman to put a picture of a brain before your eyes, but I couldn't ask him to show a picture of a thought or an ideal or a picture of goodness. And when it comes to prayer, most of us think that prayer is a part of the invisible world, the spiritual world. The great philosopher Whitehead said, religion is what a man does with his solitariness. And I'm sure that many of you would agree. I've heard you say what is really the same thing. I've heard this. I can worship in the great outdoors better than in a church, before a mountain peak, or beside a swiftly running river, or in the silence of the country where only the birds are heard. I belong to a church which for 16 years worked to produce a new prayer book. This prayer book. Why? Aren't we mixing up our worlds, our sensible and our invisible worlds, when we produce a prayer book? Aren't we making prayer external, formal, physical, unreal? Well, that's a good question, and it deserves a good answer. I think that perhaps I can answer it best by talking a little about the story of the prayers that are in the prayer books. Here, for example, is a prayer used in our church. Lord of all power and might, who art the author and giver of all good things, graft in our hearts the love of thy name, increase in us true religion, nourish us with all goodness, and of thy great mercy keep us in the same, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Now, where did it come from? We know that it is almost 1,500 years old. It may have been written by Pope Gelasius, who lived at the end of the 5th century. And once it was written, it was used over and over again. It was probably said by King Alfred the Great. It was used in the Middle Ages, and has certainly been used in the church I belong to for well over 1,000 years, and in English for 400. Now let's say you want to pray. You want to lift up your heart to heaven and ask God to make your life one in which there is the fullness of reality and the fullness of blessing. Can you find better words than these? The love of God which grows in our soul, our real religion. All these things are expressed in these words in a way that I could never do with words of my own. This prayer has been tested in use through the long centuries. It's the crystallized devotion of one man, which has been made available for us through the worship of the church, so that we can have the same kind of experience he had, and see with his eyes what are man's greatest needs, and God's answer to those needs. And something else. When I pray these words, I can pray them with others who also find them here. Now look at this. You can't help but realize the care that must have gone into making it. And in this one, you can see even more clearly the work that was done on the first letter of a sentence. There's the loving devotion of the artist in that letter. They weren't just being fancy in these old books. It was because their prayers meant so much to them. They were so valuable in changing their whole lives. So they've worked with loving attention on the written words themselves that expressed everything their souls could say. Did you ever hear the story of St. Columba? I don't guarantee that I have every detail right, but it goes something like this. There was a beautiful missal which Columba, as a young man, admired greatly. It was the property of an old monk and was kept in the church. Columba wanted it so badly that he crept into this church night after night when no one was around, and he copied the missal faithfully and fully, every decoration of the letters, every picture. After weeks and months of this, just as he was finished, the old monk caught him at it and claimed the copy. I suppose it was a primitive kind of copyright he was appealing to. But Columba wouldn't give up. What he claimed was his own work. So finally the dispute was brought before the king. The king said, "To the cow belongs its calf," and gave Columba's careful copy to the monk. The young Columba wasn't at all satisfied, and because this all happened in Ireland, there was a war about it. Finally, Columba was banished and forced to go far enough away so that he could not see Ireland. So he settled on the island of Iona, off the coast of Scotland, and once there he began to preach Christianity. And that's how Christianity first came to Scotland. But my point in telling this is to show how very much the men of those days cared about their prayers, the written words themselves, if they worked over them, thought about them, and even took it to court. It wasn't just the monks and priests who cherished their books of prayers. As early as 1400, there were primers of prayers for lay people in English. Look at that spelling. I'd almost think of that one of my family has written those lines. In these prayer books, you have a set of signals for reaching the unseen. Signals which have been developed over the centuries, and signals which work. They do lift up your eyes to the everlasting hills and to the God from whom comes your help. They've been tested in the fires of human need. They are bits of this practical, everyday world which help you to reach the other, invisible world. When you come to think of it, we continually need this world in order to reach the other. We're not pure spirits. We're creatures of flesh and blood. Never forget that the first great message of the Christian gospel is that the Word was made flesh and lived among us. That's why we have prayer books and pictures and church buildings. Think for a minute of all the things the church building says to you. Even before you see it, you hear it. That says, "Come to worship." When I was 12, I used to ring the chimes in our church. It was during the First World War. Every day at noon on my way home from school, I rang those chimes for 2 minutes, reminding the people to pray for our boys who were fighting overseas. The only trouble was that the rector also made me ring those chimes for a full half hour before the 8 o'clock service on Sunday mornings. I became pretty unpopular for calling people to God when some of them were wanting to sleep in. In a way, a church building is a visual story telling of man's progress to God. The bell is God calling him. The narthex, or porch, represents the place where many of us are, at the door, but before we begin to make our religion real. A lot of people, as far as religion is concerned, are just like holidayers on the beach. They're all dressed up in bathing suits, but they're afraid of getting wet. This stands for the beginning of the Christian life, the font, where you are baptized. And then inside, where we come into God's presence and are led to the altar, which represents our full communion with God. And here at the altar, a plate and a cup, everyday things, eating and drinking, used for the sacrament of the Lord's Supper, when Jesus Christ said, "Do this in remembrance of me." All through the ages, men have found that things they could see and touch taught them about God. And in the Middle Ages, when very few people could read, They were taught by these. It's not so different from now. These were the comic books of those days. An easy, entertaining way to tell Bible stories and to teach about the saints. Such windows as this still teach these lessons. There's a nice story of a little girl in Sunday school. The lesson was about the saints, and she said, "I've been to church. I know what a saint is. A saint is someone who lets the light shine through." We can learn the truth about the invisible world with our eyes, and with our ears, our voices, our hands. In a lot of churches, there are carvings in wood and stone, carvings of symbols that teach us about God's world and the men we call his saints. Symbols in windows, in tapestries, in paintings. Symbols like these. I look, and I know that Jesus Christ was made fun of and tormented. His hands and his feet were nailed down. A spear was thrust in his side. He was crucified for me. All this I know, and all this is told me in the feeling of this wood carving. And then God raised him from the dead, and the instrument of a criminal's execution became the symbol of my salvation. I come back to this prayer book. It's a physical thing, made up of all the carbohydrates and other materials that go into paper. We can't get away from the physical. We're not intended to. For these prayer book prayers are real. A man took paper. He took ink. He took a pen. He used his brain. The craftsman took stone. He took a chisel. He used his hands. The artist took paper, or material, or glass. He took colors and paints and threads, and with his hands and his eyes he fashioned them. The bell maker listened for the right tone of metal striking metal. All things of this world. And God used them, and uses them now, to lift us into the unseen world, on this earth, and never leaving this earth. We can enter heaven.